Hello everyone, welcome to freepilotgroundschool.ca. My name is Francis Hain. I'll be your guide and your instructor for this online ground school. This is our introduction. I will talk to you about what you can expect in the next roughly 40 hours or so of online ground school. We'll start with the rationale for this ground school. This was my COVID project after COVID hit, and I was sitting at home thinking about things I could do to keep active. This came to mind, so I took some of my old ground school presentations that I had, modified them a whole bunch, added voiceover, did a bunch of stuff, and well, 9 months later, I'm finally have this somewhat online. The whole idea for this is for people that were sitting at home, interested in flying, but they couldn't go flying, and this would be a way for them to get started, perhaps on their private or recreational pilot license. We'll talk briefly about this rationale. The idea behind it is you work at your own pace. You will have seen on freepilotgroundschool.ca the lessons. You just work through them whenever you have some time. Some lessons are longer, some lessons are shorter. It's also, like the name says, it's free, freepilotgroundschool.ca. So if you just want to learn a bit about aviation and work your way through these PowerPoint presentations, you can do so for free. If you complete them and you figure, hey, you know what, I want to get into flight training, I want to do my written test, well, it counts and you can move ahead with that. Also, there's no waiting list to get in, and you can review this material as much as you wish until you understand it. So it goes pretty quick, and if you need to watch the video over again, there's nothing wrong with doing that. I just want to clarify what this course is not. And this course is not a substitute for one-on-one instruction with a flight instructor. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in flying and you do this ground school, let's say your flying school doesn't offer a ground school, what I'd encourage you to do is work your way through these videos and then get together with an instructor, maybe after you've done a lesson, 5 or 10 hours, go through the material with an instructor for maybe an hour or two, just to make sure that you understand the material well. This also is not a hand-holding exercise. There's no instructor that's going to walk you through and explain things to you. If I can't explain it to you, sorry about that, but you'll have to get an instructor to explain it better if it still doesn't make sense. And the last thing, I want to give no illusions that this is some high quality production like the King Productions. Those are the Martha and John King are the husband and wife team that produce King videos in the United States. They've been doing it for decades, since like the 70s, and by now they have a full multimedia studio, and I mean, they sell thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of their videos a year. So that's not what this is. There are many other online ground schools as well. I believe Harv's there at free pilot, or their pilottraining.ca. They're considerably more in depth than this one is, but you might want to work through at a bit of a faster pace and not be concerned about things like the alloying ingredients in the bearings for the gyro gimbal bearings or something silly like that. I'm being facetious, but they do have a reputation for being really in depth, which is generally, I would say, a really good thing. But it's not free. So if you want something that's better quality, more in depth, I'd encourage you to check that website out at pilottraining.ca. Let's talk about the private pilot written examination. It is 100 questions of multiple choice, 3 hours. And it's not terribly difficult. It's kind of like a first-year college course, but there is a lot of information to memorize and understand. And just getting used to the lingo. If you've been around an aircraft before and you know, well, what's an elevator? Well, that's obvious, and we can go just straight into how an elevator works. However, if you've never been around aircraft before, and I start talking about the elevator, well, that's something else you have to learn. Well, what is an elevator? And it's going to, take a bit of time just to learn the things that I take for granted. There are 4 sections on the written exam. There's air law, meteorology, navigation, and general knowledge. General knowledge is broken up into theory of flight, airframes, engines, and systems, flight instruments, flight operations, and human factors. You have to pass each section, 60% to pass the exam. So you can't fail meteorology, but get 90 on everything else and still pass. But if you fail one section, they will allow you to rewrite only that section. However, if you fail the section a second time, you have to rewrite the entire exam. If you fail overall, so less than 60%, you have to get a complete rewrite. Let's talk about the structure of the ground school. I recommend that you go through the videos in the order as presented on freepilotgroundschool.ca. It starts, unfortunately, with the really boring stuff, air law. It's pretty much death by PowerPoint. I apologize. It's text on PowerPoint and me talking. Sometimes I put a bit of excitement into it by talking about a case where somebody was charged with a violation or something like that, but it's really dry. But the idea behind it is if you can get through it and you can get through the pre-solo test air regulations, that's called a P-STAR test, which you need prior to flying solo for your student pilot permit. If you can get through that part, well, you'll get through the rest of it pretty easy. If you give up at that point, well, it doesn't look like you're going to get a pilot's license. But at least you haven't wasted your time with the exciting stuff and then just to find out that the rest of it's too boring. So I encourage you get through that material. Yes, it is boring, but I promise you it does get more exciting. And then once you go flying, of course, it's really exciting. After the air law, you're going to continue with things like aerodynamic systems and instruments. Those are principles that you're going to use early in your flight training. Next is meteorology. And that's going to kind of coincide with where you're going to be about halfway through your flight training, looking at the weather, making a decision whether the weather is good enough to fly or whether you should stay on the ground. And then the last in the training is navigation, which is also covered near the end of your flight training, where you, instead of just flying from your home airport, you now say, hey, I want to go from one airport and navigate to another airport. And that's really what flying's all about, and it's fun and practical. And so that's covered near the end of this ground school. And then the very last subject we finish off with is human factors in pilot decision making. And it's kind of the last subject covered prior to getting your pilot's license, because once you're a licensed pilot, you no longer have an instructor looking over your shoulder, making a decision for you, telling you whether the weather is good enough to go flying or the plane is airworthy. It's all up to you, and you need to make those decisions by yourself. So that's why it's covered last. There's a number of handouts available on freepilotgroundschool.ca to complement the videos. And the red titles mean that there's an emphasis on the subject on the exam. So if you look at the private pilot license study and reference guide, they'll have little bullet points, little dots beside them, and that means that there's a particular emphasis. So if you see something red, you probably should memorize it or really focus on that. Some things are boring, and I acknowledge that, and I have a boring stamp that I put on some of the slides. So it's kind of funny, and I don't know, maybe I shouldn't do it, but I'm just going to be honest with you. Some things are boring. You might want to just like doze off and think about something else. I also have a useless stamp. Sometimes there is information that is absolutely useless, and I have no idea why it's on the exam. So for example, the automatic direction finder. The automatic direction finder was antiquated 20 years ago when I started learning to fly, and it's still even more antiquated now. So this is like Second World War technology. Most ground stations have them decommissioned. In the aircraft, they generally either don't work or they have been taken out because they're heavy and not worth fixing. But for some reason, you need to know about it. At least I'll be honest with you. It is useless information, but I do have to cover it as per the rules. Here's all the content that we'll be covering: licensing requirements, air law, theory of flight, flight instruments, airframes, engines, and systems, flight operations, meteorology, navigation, radio and electronic theory, and human factors. We'll just talk about some recommended textbooks that I'd encourage you to get. The first one's the From the Ground Up. This is the official textbook that training pilots have been using for since the 1950s, probably, for a very long time anyway. To be honest with you, I'm not a terribly big fan of this textbook. You should get it, but there's a lot better information available, and some of it's available for free online. The second one you definitely need to get is an aeronautical information manual from Transport Canada. And thankfully, that's free online. It's a PDF, covers all sorts of things like air law procedures, weather reports. And I would guess you can probably get the majority of the information you need out of that publication. You don't need to know all of it because there's stuff that pertains to instrument flight rules and transoceanic crossings, but it's an excellent reference. You will need a flight training manual. It's a Transport Canada document, and so has a few errors in it, which I take great pleasure in pointing out in my lectures. But that covers all the actual, like how to fly the airplane that you'll need for your flight training. You don't need it for this ground school, but you'll need it for when you are learning how to fly. There's the when in doubt, small and large aircraft critical surface contamination. You can get that from Transport Canada. The Air Command Weather Manual. You can get on freepilotgroundschool.ca. There's another excellent resource, See How It Flies by John Denker, I believe. His website is aviation8tn.com. He's just kind of a private guy. He might have a flight instructor rating, but he's a physicist. And so he really knows a lot about theory of flight. And a lot of the lecturing that I do on theory of flight in this ground school, I've got from his book. I've learned a tremendous amount from him, and it's free. So I'd encourage you to download that as well. There's the Human Factors for Aviation Basic Handbook, which your flying school should have. And then you can also download the Private Pilot License Flight Training Essentials, Theory and Procedures. That's free. It's a free PDF, and it's written by me. And it just kind of distills in a nutshell what you need to know for each air exercise. Let's talk about material required for ground school. You'll need a visual VFR navigation chart, and you can download a sample one for the Thunder Bay region on freepilotgroundschool.ca, or you can pick one up at Hammond Aviation for wherever you fly out of. You're going to need a chart wheel and protractor for flight planning, a flight computer. Yes, I know all of you are saying like, oh, can I use an app? No, you can't. Why can't I? I don't know. That's just the way it is. Sorry about it. So you have to get one of these old, we call them whiz wheels, and you have to do it the old-fashioned way. But it could be worse. I could just say you have to draw it out and then use the cosine law to solve the unknowns. But I'm not going to do that. You get like an old whiz wheel, which is like just slightly more advanced than an abacus. I'm not joking, by the way. Canada Flight Supplement, if you want to get one, you can, or you can look at the stuff online. If you do flight training, you're going to need a headset. I'd recommend that you buy a good high quality one, such as Bose or David Clark. It's going to save your hearing. The better quality ones will last for ages. I fly with the Bose 820, which I love because it's really quiet, but I also have a couple David Clarks that have lasted me since I learned to fly like 25 years ago. They're still working, and David Clark is known for having just phenomenal quality and great customer service. So I'd really encourage you to go with one of those two brands. It's not worth buying a cheap brand for $100 or something like that, thinking you got a good deal. Yes, you got a good deal. It'll last you a year, then something will break, and then you're going to end up buying a good one anyway. You want a kneeboard or clipboard to organize your maps for cross-country flying, and a pilot bag, just whatever kind of bag that you want to put all your stuff in. I usually buy my stuff at Hammond Aviation. They've always been good to me. You can also pick it up at VIP Pilot or Aircraft Spruce. So that concludes this introduction. I hope you enjoy it, this lesson, or you enjoy this ground school, and I hope that I can keep you interested for the next 40 hours of ground school training. And I wish you all the best, safe flying, and we'll see you in our next lesson where we begin with the mind-numbing subject of licensing requirements. We'll see you there.